From Nashville, Tennessee, Music City, USA, and the home of hot chicken, it's the Rick Altizer Show. Sit back, buckle up. Rick will talk with the movers, shakers, and creators who put Christ in Christian entertainment. He's a man who's clear so the world can hear. Here's Rick Altizer.
Hey, thank you for joining me today. That was Bob Allen, the voice of the Rick Altizer Show. And today I'm in the living room of kind of a music industry legend. He's a behind-the-scenes kind of guy. He says he enjoys being backstage better than he does front stage.
That's so true. So true.
But with me today is a name for people who have been in the industry. The insiders are going to know this name. Dan Posthuma is my guest today. And Dan has been kind of a staple in the Christian music industry for quite a while. And Dan, thank you for being on the show today.
Happy to be here, Rick.
I'm so glad to have you. And I'm sitting here in your living room, and this is awesome.
It's good to be with you. Good to talk about Christian music. That's always fun.
Yeah. So, Dan, just kind of give us an idea of kind of how you got started and how you got started with the Gaithers and kind of where it went from there.
I started working with the Gaithers as their, I actually started as a bass player in their custom recording studio in the middle of the cornfields in Indiana, Alexandria, Indiana. This is the time that things were kind of exploding for them. They were moving from churches into auditoriums and then into arenas. I mean, major, huge, big, 15, 20,000 seat arenas. Bill came to me and said, we need more people on stage. Can you put together a band? Several of the wives that were tied to the industry, to Bill's organization, sang, including my wife, Sarah. So put together a rhythm section and some brass players and some singers and started producing those shows and learned a lot from Bill and Gloria. They're just absolutely incredible communicators and didn't know much about Southern gospel music, but I understood the power of those lyrics and how those audiences responded. So part of that for me was great education, but also we started working with some other artists. We bring more contemporary artists out on stage for the second half. We started with a guy by the name of Don Francisco, who had...
He's alive.
That's the one right there.
That's my Don Francisco impersonation.
Keep working on it. But yeah, I tell you, it was fascinating because, Gaithers crowd, this was a pretty conservative crowd. They didn't know much about guitar music or anything like that. We would bring Don out in his long hair and his guitar slung over his shoulders and his blue jeans, and Bill was just such a master at setting this up. And people would kind of look in confusion, like, who's that hippie on Gaither's stage? And Bill would walk up to the microphone and he'd say, you know what, folks, you may not think you like guitar music, but this young man has a song you need to hear. And he'd go sit down on the piano bench, just 10 feet away. And Don would walk up to the microphone, and he'd start that song.
He's alive.
He's alive. And the story of the crucifixion of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. And I tell you, by the time he got to that chorus that you just tried to sing, that place would come unglued. And it was... all right, I don't know about that kind of music, those people would say, but I know the Jesus he's singing about, and I know that it's real. And so it was a just wonderful thing.
So as a producer for his show, you were putting the band together, you were doing the charts, you were kind of arranging everything.
Yep. And just making sure that it sounded right and looked right, and it was all new for us, new for them to go into those huge arenas and compete with. The other pop artists that were going in those places.
So then from Gaither kind of presenting the band and organizing the band. And
another artist after Don was Amy. She was just coming
Amy
out.
Grant.
Amy Grant. She had just done her first album, and she was still, I think she was a sophomore in college, and we would have her come out and sing a couple songs in the second half. And it was the same kind of reaction. People didn't know who she was, but they were just drawn to this little brown-eyed girl who could sing these beautiful songs. And
she started on Bill Gaither concerts.
Yeah.
I never knew that. So she would come out as a sophomore in college and sing a couple songs in the second half of a Bill Gaither concert.
My Father's Eyes, Old Man's Rubble. Do you remember that too?
Uh-huh.
Old Man's Rubble. She played the piano horribly. I said, Amy, it's hard to find somebody who can play the piano worse than Bill Gaither, but I think we have here. But she was just so charming and a great communicator herself, obviously. So people fell in love with her. After that was Sandy Patty, brought her out for about a season or two, and she had this incredibly powerful song, We Shall Behold Him, and same thing, people would just erupt when they would hear the power of that voice and that song together. So that's how I started working with some other artists besides Bill and Gloria. And I left Alexandria. Sarah and I moved to Nashville in '81 to work with Amy and produced her Age to Age tour. That was her second record, and Word Records wanted to have a big promotional tour that would help promote and sell the record. And we put together a pretty incredible band with some great arrangements, and had a wonderful time taking her craft to the stage and making it.
Now, what is producing a tour? What does that mean? I understand about producing a record. What's producing a tour entail?
Finding the musicians, finding the band members, coming up with the arrangements. You want to do something similar to the arrangements on the record and yet different enough to keep people interested. And there's some things you can do that are kind of captivating from a live situation.
Would you work on stagecraft?
Yeah.
And, hey, you stand over here. Hey, and on this part of the solo, why don't you walk over to this part of the stage, and you, bass player, come up and meet him, and you guys look at each other and kind of go, hey, and your shoulder goes up this way, and this shoulder goes up that way.
Maybe not. Maybe they get into the shoulder action. It's kind of like blocking, but for theatrical performance. But more than that, just trying to set the right kind of tone for them to have fun on stage, and the pacing of a concert is incredibly important. Much different than the pacing on a record. What you start with when you turn a corner musically from a feel standpoint or from a message standpoint.
So you would be involved in the song order of the set. So you'd put that together as well.
Yeah, and then help Amy figure out how to set up these songs in a way that was true to the overall message she was trying to convey. Or any artist, that's what a producer does.
Well, I'm talking with music industry legend Dan Posthuma, and he's talking about starting out producing live shows for Bill Gaither and then Amy Grant. So you've produced Amy Grant. Talk then after that, then where from there? I know you did some stuff with Russ Taff and some other things from there.
Yeah. Besides producing live concerts, which was very satisfying to me, I wanted to get involved in record production. I'd done some of that with Gaithers in the Southern Gospel field, but I wanted to do something in the pop or rock field. And one of the artists that Word had me work with is a Southern California girl by the name of Leslie Phillips.
Yep.
Remember her?
I went to church with her.
Oh, did you really?
Mm-hmm.
Church on the Way?
Church on the Way.
Oh,
yeah. We went to church together.
I started working with her in concert, and then she had already done one record, I believe. I know one record, and then she asked me to produce her second record, and I was pretty excited about that. I was working out in L.A., working with her and another artist by the name of Benny Hester.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that name. So they both asked me to produce records for them. So I had a chance to use L.A. players, L.A. studio, L.A. engineers, and come up with I was very pleased with the sound, the approach that we were able to get on a couple of those records, and they were big records for Leslie and Benny.
Mm-hmm.
So it was satisfying to work with the greatest studio musicians in the world, same guys that were playing for Sting and Bryan Adams and everybody else.
And I'm glad you bring that up, because I mentioned, I think the movie industry now is a lot like what the music industry was like in the early and mid 80s.
That makes sense, sure.
That, but prior to the 80s, it was kind of a burgeoning new industry. Not many people knew about the music industry. And then the labels started getting connected with other secular labels, and money started, the budgets went up. then you're able to now get a nice studio in LA and hire the top studio musicians who are playing on, Michael Jackson's records. You can have them play on Leslie Phillips records or whatever. And at that point in the 80s, the quality level just shot up in the music industry. And I'm seeing that in the movie industry today as the budgets are going up and as people are getting, really as Passion of the Christ kind of opened that door. And then the Kendrick brothers came, which I've had on the show. But then all of a sudden we're seeing this new, with great movies like, Case for Christ and these new movies that are coming out that are just so well done. Talk about that, how you saw the music industry in the 80s started kind of just opening up.
Yeah, I think, whenever a person comes to faith, they want to express that in the medium and the vernacular that they're accustomed to. And in the early 80s, there were some active churches that were doing some incredible things with music, and artists that grew out of those churches. They wanted to find the musical expressions that were common to them and were satisfying from a musical standpoint and from a message standpoint. So I think record companies also started to realize that if we up the quality of these albums a bit, they're going to sell more. Christian radio was a very important part of that. Getting music that is attractive to the radio format was an important part of exposing the records and the artists. So all of a sudden, there were records coming out of the Christian music world that could compete with everything and anything you heard in the pop world.
And there seemed to be this, this marketing world behind it. You had CCM magazine all of a sudden, and here's Amy Grant on the cover of this magazine, and
right.
And you had concerts now, and you had these Christian radio stations started playing popular, music that started sounding more popular. Then they maybe have a little on a Saturday night they'd have a rock little show, and you'd hear Petra, and you'd hear different stuff. So It just seemed like things were starting to open up. Talk about what, from your perspective, if you have any, what some of the downside of that was, the commercialization of the Christian message.
Well, the biggest challenge is true of anybody involved in Christian ministry is success is a double-edged sword. It can strengthen what you're trying to do, but it also presents a lot of challenges, especially for musicians, people who are on stage all the time, away from home a lot, away from the church accountability base. There's the challenges of that kind of notoriety and that kind of attention. There's some obvious spiritual issues that can come into play with that, which is why having an accountable team is so important.
What's an accountable team? People
around you that can say, don't believe your own press release, basically. People have known you long enough to be able to say, you're headed for trouble here.
Yeah, and I know now that labels, the Christian labels will have pastors and they'll have counselors, and they'll send their artists and their wives to counseling, and they'll pay for it, and they'll have pastors. Because I think in the 80s, we saw some of that. People had success, and then their lives kind of imploded, and their personal lives kind of blew up because they weren't able to. They're very young. I had this discussion with Bill Gaither. They're very young. They get thrust into the spotlight. They're young in the Lord. They're not mature in the Lord. They really don't have much to say spiritually because they're so young. But because they're young, they're attractive to commercially, but they don't have the wisdom of someone who's in their 40s who has been a Christian for a while and has navigated some of those roads. So they get thrown in that spotlight with really an immature faith, and it's difficult. So I think that the industry has learned now from the 80s, because we saw so many of those acts did go, they left their faith. So many of those people that were number one on Christian radio aren't professing Christians anymore.
It is hard for anybody in show business or entertainment business to maintain a proper work-life balance. And when you add faith into that element, which should be the foundational element, it can get distorted very, very quickly.
So, you start out, then you began producing. So you transitioned from producing shows, hiring band members, arranging the songs, ordering the song order,
right.
And that's just a natural step to a record producer who hires band, puts arrangements together, puts song order together, gets the best performance out of the artist.
I've always said that, in my opinion, when you're in front of an audience, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's when you know whether a song or an idea or sometimes even a vocal lick is going to work or not going to work. It's very hard to tell in the isolated situation of the studio. So for me, it was important for me to spend time with an artist in front of their audience before even thinking about stepping into the studio, to understand what it is that they're trying to say and who they're trying to say it to. And then taking that knowledge and then crafting a record based on that.
I'm talking with industry insider and kind of legend, I won't say in his own mind, but Dan Posthuma is with me, producer. And then from you produced other acts. Obviously, you started out with Leslie Phillips, Benny Hester. They were very successful. So right off the bat, you have these great successes. So now you're the golden boy.
For 15 minutes, I was a new hot rock and roll Christian producer.
You were the guy.
It was an exciting time. Well, I love that kind of music, and again, working with those players and those in those studios was a great thrill. Did some work after that with Brian Duncan, who is just one of the most amazing vocalists ever, and Crystal Lewis too. Just drop dead, breathtakingly beautiful voices. And lots of others. So I've been very blessed to work with some talented people.
Many acts, and you're modest. You're not going to go down your list, but the guy's produced lots of people. And then from there, as a producer, then you got hired by Word, Murr, which is a division of Word,
right.
To be then the head of the A&R department. Talk about what an A&R department is and what it does.
A&R stands for Artists and Repertoire, although often they say it stands for Airports and Restaurants, because you spend a lot of time on the road looking for artists to sign. They're the creative entity in a record company. They're the people that find artists to sign and then put them in the right creative environment to be able to write properly, write songs and record. So it is, it's a challenging position. Very, very. You're trying to be the bridge between the creative and the commercial side of the recording process. So help the artist create something that works for them, they're proud of, then help the record company in how to market it and how to expose it, and radio singles and magazine ads and all those elements. So the A&R guy is the guy that bridges the gap between the creative world and the commercial aspect.
Now, did you continue to produce while you were head of A&R?
Yeah, I did.
So you were busy.
I was busy, and I wanted to do that because I love producing. Word, Roland Lundy was gracious enough to allow me to continue to produce, and it's an important thing from my standpoint because as an A&R director, you should be very aware of what the creative process is and keep current with who's the latest engineer or arranger or whatever. So that was important. And at that point at Murr, we had a great roster. Amy Grant was on the roster, Russ Taff and Phil Keggy and Brian Duncan and Crystal Lewis and many others. It was considered probably the most contemporary label of all the mainstream labels. Mm-hmm. We were based out of L.A. at that point. Then soon after Word was sold, they moved everything to Nashville. At that point, this is mid-'90s. Everybody was kind of coming to Nashville, realizing this is the place that could be making great records now.
So you moved to Nashville after your time with Bill Gaither. Then did you go to L.A. to produce?
Yeah, we lived in L.A. for 10 years.
All right.
And when I came on board at Murr, we had an L.A. office.
Right.
Yeah.
And then came back here then mid-'90s. And so then you continued working as an A&R guy, as a producer, and then you transitioned into a president of a record company. So you kind of went the gamut.
I did, yeah. I've been blessed to be able to do a lot of different kinds of things in this industry. It all comes down to finding great artists and great songs and moments that mean something to people.
And do you want to talk about that time, then the transition from A&R to heading up your own label?
It was, things were shifting in the industry. All the labels were being purchased by big corporations. It was time to experiment with some different kinds of labels that were a little bit smaller and more nimble, and able to focus on a particular genre of music. I had some friends that wanted to help me do a label like that called Doxology Records, and we did that for 3 or 4 years. It was a challenging time with the economy, but found some artists that we really believed in and came up with some records I'm very proud of.
And so what were some of the from what you've seen, just in the industry itself, there doesn't seem to be any history. You can't go to a store and now with iTunes, now finally you can get Keith Green, just
right.
People from the past. Whereas you can always find old Rolling Stones and Beatles. There seems to be a history in pop and rock music, but there didn't seem to be much history in our stores or support for Christian music. It just seemed to be whatever was current was on the shelves. And now you go to what were the bookstores, which were all filled with CDs. Now maybe you get one rack, 4, 5, 6 rows of CDs. I mean, it's dwindled so much. Talk about just kind of how you've seen what some of the changes the industry has gone through in these last 10, 15 years.
Well, it is, the accessibility of Christian records has always been a challenge, just because it is, even at its height, was kind of a niche market compared to pop music. But it is, I think more artists are finding ways to get to their consumer base. They're people that really love what they do. And it's so interesting to see. I have a lot of friends now that were on record labels in the 80s and 90s and now fund their own records. They have their fan base. They do a Kickstarter or a GoFundMe project, and they have people that are really interested to hear what they have to say next, and they're willing to be a part of that. And they're finding ways to make a new and different, and in some ways a much more vital connection with their fan base, and I love it because there's a spiritual journey element to our music and our artists that is sets it apart from the regular commercial music. Mm-hmm. I love anything that helps enhance that.
Where would you like to see Christian music go in the future?
People they come to a belief, to come to faith. They want to express that, like we were talking about earlier, in whatever style or vernacular or music idiom that is part of how they express themselves. So I think God's always going to use artists who are hungry to communicate His truth to the people who want to listen. I don't know where it's all going to go, but I know it's an important part of what God has for us in all this.
Well, Dan, it's been great having you here and kind of going back with letting us hear some of your story.
Well, you got a history in all this. You understand it. You were there for most of this.
Yeah, well, I was on the sidelines mostly, but it's great sharing your story, hearing a little bit about the Christian music industry and just kind of how you have been through that. And still now you're doing plays and shows as something on Broadway, and you're just all over the place. So still continuing to you always got work. You just confound me, the things you find to do.
All kinds of interesting things to be done out there, and like I said, God gives me some great opportunities, and I just try to do my best to follow them properly.
Well, obviously you have talent as a producer, putting things together, shows, making projects come together. That's kind of what you do, and you do it very well and have been doing it. And I know God will continue to open up doors for you. And we've known each other for a long time, and you're also a quality guy, man of God. So
congratulations on your show. This is wonderful. I think you're doing a really great thing here for people.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, Dan, thanks for being on the show. Appreciate it so much. That's Dan Posthuma, and I appreciate you being here. And guys, check back next week for something new on the show. Who knows? The music you are listening to is from my scripture memory record, and I want to give it to you for free. Just go to my website, rickaltizer.com, and click Contact. Altizer is spelled Altizer. Or how about liking my Facebook page, facebook.com/Rick Altizer Show. And I want to thank you for listening. So be sure to check us out again next week as we discuss how we communicate the gospel through media to our culture. Let's be clear so the world can hear. I'll talk to you next week. Thanks for listening.